Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. Hold on, cause it's ladies' night. Tonight we discuss Carmilla. Again, some more. Carmilla is the second most adapted vampire story in history. I shouldn't have to say this, but since I know someone will ask, the first is Dracula. The original novel was written in 1872 by Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and is rife with symbolism and metaphor about Irish-English political relations. Its most famous film adaptations launched the lesbian vampire genre, for better or worse, usually worse, as many of the lesbian vampire films exist as straight male fantasy fuel. But a few works have emerged that are empowering for both women and queer people. Most versions aren't perfect though, and sometimes you really have to pick out the good stuff from the rest, but they try. For those unfamiliar with the novel, the gist of the story is Laura is an innocent, sheltered damsel who lives in the middle of nowhere with her father. One day, Carmilla, a vampire who looks like a beautiful, innocent damsel, tricks her way into getting invited to stay with them. She's head over heels for Laura, which confuses and upsets Laura because homosexuality does not exist in Laura's worldview. Sadly, there was no Herald There Lesbians back then to make her realize it was a thing. It just didn't exist. But Laura's worldview also contains the Victorian notion of beauty equals goodness. So she does her best to look past Carmilla's weirdness because she's so desperate to have a friend at all, and Carmilla's so conventionally pretty, she must be pure of soul. Meanwhile, peasant women in the nearby village are dying from blood loss, and a month later, Laura starts showing symptoms accompanied by terrifying nightmares of Carmilla. One day, a relative, General Spielsdorf, arrives and says he's hunting a vampire who tricked his way into his house and killed his beautiful innocent niece. Surprise! It was also Carmilla! Bet you didn't see that one coming. Laura sure doesn't. Laura doesn't get it, because Carmilla's so pure and innocent and beautiful people must be good. Until Spielsdorf finds Carmilla's grave and destroys her, and Laura learns a valuable life lesson about trusting people and deceptive appearances. She remembers Carmilla with mixed feelings, but she yearns for the friend she wished Carmilla could be, not the pushy romance she didn't want. Le Fanu clearly understood lesbian relationships could exist, but he never lets Laura realize this. He got away with writing a lesbian story in the Victorian era by making the lesbian a monster who forces herself on the innocent and pure Laura, who never reciprocates. Instead of a story of mutual desire, it reads like a masculine fantasy of lesbianism, and Carmilla's destruction at the end is similar to the lesbian pulp novels of the mid-20th century that were only allowed to exist if the lesbians never had happy endings. Laura being with Carmilla means death, not freedom or awakening or blossoming, but literal dying. Lesbianism here is presented as a predatory, destructive force. In order to keep up Laura's serious case of the not gays, though, the novel has to lay it on really thick with her naivete. Spielsdorf tells his whole story about his niece dying that's almost exactly the same as what's happening with Laura, but Laura is so clueless that she doesn't connect it to Carmilla. Even when she sees Carmilla act all vampire-y at the end and disappear, she still doesn't get it. The author makes Laura so dumb to try to keep the reader in suspense and worried that Laura remains in danger of falling prey to her cluelessness. Considering this was the first story of its kind at the time, this wasn't entirely ridiculous. It's really hard for a modern reader to swallow though, so it's no wonder adaptations tend to headcanon Laura as smarter. But in the book itself, it's not that Laura understands what Carmilla is on any level, but secretly repressedly wants her in spite of it. No, even when Spielsdorf tells Laura that Carmilla is the same vampire, Laura's still like, nah, can't be, not my Carmilla. But then, Spielsdorf destroys the vampire and Carmilla disappears for good, and Laura says, "I saw all clearly a few days later. The disappearance of Carmilla was followed by the discontinuance of my nightly sufferings." Like, oh my god, surprise twist! Carmilla was the vampire! Yeah, we all put that together a while ago. Maybe Victorian audiences could be on board with a character this dumb, but modern interpretations need to do something new with Laura to keep the audience engaged. So, the adaptation we're looking at tonight is a 2014 stage play called Carmilla, by American author David MacDowell Blue. The play ran in New York and LA and made two significant changes to the story. The first is that it's set in World War II era Austria, which adds some interesting thematic layers. And the second is that it asks the question of, what if, instead of being repulsed by Carmilla's romantic overtures, Laura returned them? This is a twofold hurdle for Laura's character. First, she must be changed to a woman who loves women. And second, she must be able to reconcile that whole murderous vampire thing. Somehow. You know, the big one. The first seems simple. Make Laura gay, sure, why not? The popular Carmilla web series, which we've discussed before, does this, having Laura start the story as an out and proud lesbian. But the second part is a whole lot more tricky to get Laura on board with. For instance, in that web series, Carmilla spends seasons atoning for her past evils and developing and changing into a new person with moralities Laura can finally truly love. But in this play, well, first of all, treating the homosexuality as a separate thing from the vampire stuff is pretty much impossible when they are so intrinsically entwined in the original novel. The web series manages it by having an entire cast of queer characters, so the sole lesbian representation isn't a murderous, deceptive, corrupting monster. But this play sticks pretty close to the original story, aside from the time period change, and Laura's world is still overwhelmingly heteronormative. In the novel, Carmilla manipulates her way into Laura's life under the guise of friendship, but then starts pushing their relationship with suggestive comments. And this ain't no repressed Victorian subtext stuff. She says things that are unquestionably romantic, and they make Laura very uncomfortable. The only explanations Laura can conceive are, maybe Carmilla is actually a boy in disguise. 'Cause that would be great if she were. Laura would love a boy to talk to her the way Carmilla does, because when Carmilla does it, it's kind of creepy. But if she were really a boy, that would be great. Or Carmilla must be literally insane, as homosexuality can only be explained by mental illness. Laura tries not to dwell on it too much, though, as she prefers to dismiss it and change the subject to preserve her comfort bubble. Carmilla's romantic declarations are often described in the book as leaving Laura trembling, her heart beating faster, her breath growing rapid, and though these are all physical reactions that can be associated with seduction and arousal, Laura accompanies them with words like dreadful and terror and the feeling of being strangled. Not in a sexy way. The girl is miserable and afraid. Her bosom isn't heaving because she's secretly into it. Sure, Victorian readers might have found her fear erotic if they were into that kind of thing, and modern readers certainly do, hence all the sexy Carmilla reimaginings. But Laura herself is repulsed. When she says, "Had I been capable of comprehending my condition, I would have invoked aid and advice on my knees." That is not a euphemism. She is actually afraid and thinks she needs to pray to God for her safety. To headcanon it all as, but what if she's lying and she really is attracted to Carmilla, is the same as saying something like, what if all of Harry Potter's animosity towards Draco is actually attraction? It's an interesting and exciting what if AU to play with, but if you go so far as to insist it's canon, it undermines the reality of the actual real terror and suffering of victims of abuse. The fact that Laura still wants to be Carmilla's adoring friend in spite of Carmilla's rapey pushiness confuses and upsets Laura. The supernatural allure of the vampire is too great for Laura to accept the negative way her body and instincts urge her to react. And in this way, Carmilla's homosexual influence is one and the same with her vampire nature. And Le Fanu states a morality conclusion that homosexuality is as evil as vampirism. Yeah. Nobody wants that kind of nonsense anymore nowadays. So, in this play, Laura is romantically and sexually attracted to Carmilla immediately.
Have you noticed how one can be thirsty or hungry and be totally unaware of that fact until one smells food or sips a little water?
Carmilla is presumably the first queer woman this sheltered Laura's ever met, and her interest awakens Laura's understanding of her own sexuality. They carry on a schoolgirl sort of romance at first, but even when Carmilla starts to act weird, throwing a tantrum at the trinket peddler and having a fit at the funeral, Laura takes it in stride. The play doesn't show Carmilla having any sort of supernatural influence over Laura, so it seems it's solely Laura's sincere crush on her that allows her to get past these glimpses into Carmilla's darker side. Laura, therefore, takes on a harder and colder personality than the sweetness of her origins. She lies to her father. She barely reacts to news of tragedy in the world around them, and she seems to care for nothing but her own love life. When Carmilla starts to drink Laura's blood, it's presented as erotic. Laura blatantly lies about being terrified and remembering nothing romantic about it. And unlike the book, where being bitten is horribly painful,
Needles against my flesh, entering me. This should hurt, should cause great pain. Why does it not?
And afterward, Laura's health hardly suffers at all.
This was when I began to fall ill. Nothing serious, you understand, more lack of sleep than anything else.
She's fine. Carmilla speaks to Laura of dying like she does in the book, but the implication is that she really means undying. She wants to make Laura a vampire so that they can be together. And as the play shows us no negative side to being a vampire and only Laura's attraction to it, this is not an outcome to be feared, but instead a happily ever after. So, instead of Laura's livelihood being in danger, the stakes here are them being driven apart, losing their romance. And this plot point arrives in the form of Spielsdorf. Only now, instead of him being a grieving savior, he's an evil Nazi. In order to make Carmilla romantic, she can't be the villain of the story anymore. So, the play creates a new antagonist. Nazis are notoriously homophobic, and Spielsdorf arrives to slay Laura and Carmilla's love. Oh, but just in case that's not enough to make him more evil than a murderous vampire, he is also now a sexual abuser. We learn that Carmilla didn't kill his niece after all, because she's romantic now, so of course she can't murder anyone Laura actually cares about. No, here, it's implied Spielsdorf had been sexually abusing his niece since she was 9 years old. And when Carmilla came into the niece's life, she provided an awakening, similar to Laura's, but also empowerment. She gave the niece the strength to put an end to her uncle's abuse by taking her own life. 'Cause suicide is how female empowerment works. And pedophile Nazi uncle is so pissed off about it that he must slay this uppity vampire woman who's running around the countryside smashing the patriarchy. By making Spielsdorf the villain instead of the hero, the play sheds the homophobic messages of the original novel, and becomes, instead, a story about the tragic losses of war at the hands of intolerance. And the twist at the end is that even though Laura never hears from Carmilla again, she is now a vampire, continuing the cycle, empowering new women with her kinky love. She gets her revenge against Spielsdorf by draining his blood, and though she doesn't seem happy exactly, she's at least successful. The person she's talking to through all this is Martin, a British attorney who's investigating war crimes. Martin admonishes Laura over and over again for being clueless about what was going on in the world in the days leading up to the war. However, Laura's replies being so defensive about how isolated her life was, combined with the heavy-handed condescension on Martin's part, makes it difficult to say whether the play is actually trying to criticize or excuse people who idly allow evil to go unchecked in the world. And the connection of this evil to the vampire as a literary device is nebulous. In the original book, the vampire represents infection of degeneracy, and in the whole Irish-British political allegory, symbolized the fear of an oppressed people taking over the oppressor once integrated into society, like vermin spreading from within. In the play, the evil force, the Nazis taking over and oppressing, is kind of the opposite of this.
The law was the protection of German blood and honor. This defines precisely what shall constitute racial pollution and blood defilement.
For the racial purists, the vampire is supreme impurity. And since Nazis are always the free space in the bingo card of evil, that means vampires here are automatically sympathetic targets by contrast. So are the Nazis the real vampire? In that case, what does that make Carmilla? Another victim of the Holocaust? But though she was innocent of killing the niece, she did still murder all those girls in the village, and yeah, nebulous. I would have loved to see this idea explored more clearly. The play is only one act, and the ending feels rushed and anticlimactic. Maybe if it had had more time and development, the themes could have landed better. But even in the book, it's clear that Carmilla is a reluctant vampire, and her passion for Laura is real. And it's hard not to feel at least some sympathy for someone so complex, even as the story's moral tries to turn us against her. She hates that her nature makes her kill people. That's why she gets so upset at the funeral of the peasant girl she eats. She hopes she can win Laura over to her ways, but laments there's a chance Laura might hate her when she learns the truth. It's never exactly explained why Laura is special compared to all the other girls Carmilla kills, why Carmilla visits Laura of all people as a child and then comes back again so many years later. Perhaps it's because they're distantly related. Laura is descended from Carmilla's family, the Karnsteins, and Carmilla's quite the aristocratic snob. Carmilla's repulsion of death and funerals is the torment of her curse. She tries desperately to think of herself and the plague she spreads as natural. She says, "And this disease that invades the country is natural. Nature, all things proceed from nature, don't they? All things in the heaven, in the earth, and under the earth act and live as nature ordains? I think so. And as a vampire, she is part of the earth. So she is merely performing her part in the circle of life, and that should be okay, right? Right? But it's not. And she suffers over it so much, and Laura never understands her. Carmilla doesn't need to be contrasted to Nazi pedophiles to be sympathetic to audiences. Just allowed the chance to truly express herself in the way most adaptations fail to capture. The end of the play is bleak in a way that undermines the themes of empowerment it builds up earlier. Laura wants to go track down her family in England, and Martin gives her permission to leave the country. But the vampire lore Carmilla is based on explains how vampires target their own families first. So Laura will probably be murdering them all. And as they're British, and we're to assume they were against the Nazis in the war, this is a really dark and twisted fate for supposed good guys. Also, when Martin meets Laura's roommate, and finds out her last name is Vordenberg, she mentions it seeming like a familiar name, but she's unable to place it. Only a few minutes earlier, Martin was just telling Laura about how she was trying to find the Vordenberg's next of kin to return an ancestral sword the Nazis stole. Why does she not connect this to Laura's roommate? Is she under some hypnotic power that makes her forget? Nothing in the play suggests hypnosis stuff going on, but I can think of no other reason Martin can't remember how she knows the name. And in that case, is Laura that much darker and sinister? Messing with Martin's mind the entire time? About to go start some kind of avalanche of vampire mayhem in England? And giving off serious abuser vibes with a new girlfriend while she's at it. If so, then whether the play intends it or not, we're right back to where we started with the negative lesbian portrayal we wanted to avoid at the start. I am some Maven of the Eventide, and there are a lot of interpretations of Carmilla out there to discuss, so bring 'em on! It's ladies' night.
But when the moon fades away, will my dreams come true, much as I love you? Don't let me love you.
I don't know if you noticed these, but I got some new books. This is George R.R. Martin's one and only vampire book, and this one is called Wuthering Bites. Yeah, it's a retelling of Wuthering Heights, where Heathcliff's a vampire, but he's like a half vampire who's also a vampire hunter. I cannot wait to read this. Please support me on Patreon if you want to help me make more videos. I love talking about vampires for your macabre enjoyment. Until then, good night.